The first time I realized a corporation could erase a family's history in a single morning, I was standing ankle-deep in fresh red clay with my grandmother's broken headstone lying face down in the dirt. Nobody called me. Nobody knocked on my door. They just decided that shaving a few minutes off a construction schedule mattered more than the place where my family had been saying goodbye for nearly 40 years. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 31 years old, and until all this happened, I was living a pretty ordinary life outside Pine Hollow, Mississippi. I waited tables 6 days a week at a roadside diner off Highway 49, the kind of place where everyone already knew your coffee order before you sat down. I wasn't rich. I wasn't connected. And the only property I'd ever owned was 2 acres my grandmother left me after she passed away. It wasn't valuable because of the land itself. Developers had offered to buy it before, but I always laughed and told them the same thing. My grandma already picked her forever address. Half of that property was open pasture. The other half held a small family cemetery beneath 3 enormous oak trees where my grandparents rested beside my great-grandfather. Every Sunday after work, I'd bring fresh flowers, clean the headstones, sit in an old folding chair and talk to Grandma like she was still giving me advice. Maybe that sounds strange to some people, but grief has its own language. Then one Tuesday morning, I pulled onto the gravel driveway and immediately knew something was wrong. Tire tracks covered the grass. Yellow excavators sat behind temporary fencing. Fresh trenches carved through the edge of my property like giant scars. And men wearing orange safety vests walked around carrying blueprints as if they'd owned the place their whole lives. At first, I honestly thought they'd made a mistake. I parked, climbed out of my truck, and one of the workers looked up long enough to wave me away without even asking who I was. I walked faster, then started running when I saw the cemetery. The ground around my grandmother's grave had collapsed where heavy equipment had dug too close. The concrete border surrounding her headstone had cracked in half. Fresh dirt covered the flowers I'd left only 3 days earlier, and steel pipes rested less than a few feet from where she'd been buried. I remember dropping to my knees without even feeling it. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't brush the dirt off the stone. I just kept staring at it, trying to convince myself I wasn't seeing what I was seeing. A man wearing a white hard hat finally walked over carrying a clipboard. He introduced himself like we were meeting at a neighborhood barbecue instead of beside my grandmother's damaged grave. Ma'am, this is part of an emergency infrastructure expansion. Everything has been approved. I looked him straight in the eye and asked the only question I could think of. Approved by who? He shrugged. Corporate handled the paperwork. Then he handed me a folded letter with a company logo across the top before walking away. That was it. No apology. No explanation. Just a piece of paper saying the project served the public interest and that temporary access to the property had been authorized under emergency utility regulations. The letter was signed by Regional Operations Director Richard Malone. I called the number listed at the bottom before I even got back into my truck. After 20 minutes of transfers, a woman in corporate relations politely explained they weren't discussing active projects. I told her they had destroyed part of my family cemetery. There was silence for 2 seconds before she calmly replied, "Our records indicate there are no historical or burial sites within the project boundaries." That sentence kept echoing in my head all the way home. No burial sites. I had literally been kneeling beside one. That night, I barely slept. I spread every deed, tax record, and survey my grandmother had ever kept across my kitchen table. She had saved everything in neat little folders because she believed paper outlived promises. Looking through those files almost felt like she was sitting across from me saying, "Slow down, Emmy. Facts first, anger second." So instead of screaming at strangers online or threatening lawsuits I couldn't afford, I took the next morning off work and paid for a licensed surveyor with almost every dollar I'd saved for replacing my old pickup. 3 days later, he walked the property with me, checked his instruments twice, then looked over his glasses and quietly said, "Emily, you're not just close to your line, they're well across it." Hearing those words changed something inside me. Until then, I'd thought maybe this was negligence. Maybe someone had made a terrible mistake. But standing there with fresh survey stakes marking exactly where my property ended and their equipment continued, I realized somebody hadn't simply crossed a boundary on a map. They'd crossed the line between arrogance and believing nobody like me would ever fight back. I drove home with the survey rolled up on the passenger seat, looked once more at the letter signed by Richard Malone, and made myself a promise I would remember for the rest of my life. If they wanted this to become nothing more than another forgotten complaint from another ordinary waitress, they had picked the wrong granddaughter. The survey should have been enough. In a fair world, I could have emailed the company, attached the measurements, and somebody with a conscience would have picked up the phone to say, "Ms. Carter, we're sorry. We'll fix this." Instead, 3 days after I sent the report by certified mail, I received another letter thanking me for my continued cooperation and informing me that construction would proceed as scheduled. They even addressed me by the wrong first name. I laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because I finally understood what I was dealing with. To them, I wasn't Emily. I wasn't a property owner or a granddaughter. I was case number 4418, another obstacle sitting between executives and quarterly bonuses. I drove to the regional office the following Monday, wearing the nicest clothes I owned, hoping if I looked professional someone might treat me like a human being. The receptionist smiled politely, disappeared for nearly 20 minutes, then returned with a practiced expression that told me everything before she spoke. "Mr. Malone isn't available." I nodded. "That's okay. I'll wait." She hesitated. "He's in a meeting." I glanced toward the hallway just as Richard Malone himself walked past carrying a coffee. He looked directly at me for half a second, recognized exactly who I was from the photographs I'd attached to my complaint, then deliberately turned into another hallway without saying a word. The receptionist suddenly became fascinated with organizing paper clips. That tiny moment stayed with me longer than any insult could have. He had looked at me and decided I wasn't worth 30 seconds of his day. I walked outside, sat in my truck, and cried for about 5 minutes. Then I wiped my face, started the engine, and drove straight to the county records office. If the company insisted everything was legal, then the paperwork would prove it. My grandmother always said people lie, but documents eventually tell the truth. The clerk behind the counter recognized my family name because she'd gone to church with Grandma years earlier. She couldn't give legal advice, but she quietly explained which permits were public record and how to request them. $98 later, I walked out carrying copies of environmental reports, site maps, approval forms, inspection records, and enough paperwork to fill half my kitchen table. Every evening after work, I spread those files across the living room floor with sticky notes, highlighters, and a notebook, comparing signatures, dates, and survey references 1 page at a time. It felt like assembling a giant puzzle without knowing what the finished picture was supposed to look like. Then, sometime after midnight on the 4th night, I noticed something odd. One environmental assessment described my property as undeveloped vacant acreage with no permanent structures, historical significance, or cultural resources. I read the sentence 3 times. Vacant. My grandparents had been buried there for decades. The cemetery appeared on county tax maps. The deed specifically referenced the family burial plot. There was no possible way an actual inspection could have missed it. The next morning, I drove to the county environmental office carrying the report. The inspector, whose name appeared on the document, happened to be working that day. His eyebrows pulled together almost immediately when he saw the signature. "Where did you get this?" he asked. I explained everything. He looked at the page again, then disappeared into the back office for nearly 15 minutes. When he returned, his voice had completely changed. "Ms. More for wine. Carter, I didn't sign this." My stomach dropped. He unlocked a filing cabinet, pulled out his official signature samples, and laid them beside the permit. At first glance, they looked almost identical, but once he pointed out the differences, they became impossible to ignore. The loops were slightly wrong. The pressure marks didn't match. Whoever forged it had copied the shape, not the handwriting. Then he checked another approval. Same problem. Then another. 3 forged signatures attached to the same project. He looked up at me and quietly said, "You need to report this immediately." Suddenly, this wasn't just about trespassing anymore. Somebody inside a billion-dollar utility company had falsified government documents to push a project through faster. That realization scared me more than I expected. Companies make mistakes. Criminal fraud is something entirely different. I called an attorney that afternoon, but after hearing who the defendant would be, he politely explained that a case this large would require tens of thousands of dollars to litigate. I thanked him anyway and hung up knowing there was absolutely no way I could afford that. For a couple of days, I honestly considered giving up. My savings account was almost empty. My truck needed repairs, and every hour I spent chasing paperwork meant fewer shifts at the diner. Then one evening, while refilling coffee for an elderly regular named Mr. Henderson, he noticed I looked exhausted. I told him the whole story. When I finished, he stirred his coffee for a long moment before saying something my grandmother probably would have loved. "Rich folks expect poor folks to quit because being right is expensive." He slid a $20 bill under his coffee mug, even though his meal only cost $12. Don't quit. I still think about that conversation. It didn't solve my problems, but it reminded me that someone besides me believed this fight mattered. So I stopped thinking about winning in court and started thinking about leverage. The company needed unrestricted access to that meter station every single day. They built the entire project assuming I'd eventually get tired and move on. Instead, I worked every extra shift the diner manager would give me: breakfast, lunch, double shifts on weekends. My feet hurt so badly some nights I soaked them in ice water before bed. But 2 months later, I'd saved enough money to buy a battered old shipping container from a salvage yard. The delivery driver thought I was crazy when I asked him to place it directly across the only legal access road crossing my property. We chained it in place with a heavy commercial lock. Every inch of that container sat entirely on my own land. I wasn't blocking a public road, and I wasn't trespassing. I was simply exercising the same property rights the company had ignored. The phone rang less than 3 hours later. Ms. Carter, this obstruction needs to be removed immediately. I smiled without meaning to. Obstruction? I asked. Interesting choice of words. The voice on the other end grew colder. You're interfering with critical infrastructure. I looked out my kitchen window toward the container. Actually, I'm protecting private property. There's a difference. They threatened lawsuits, emergency injunctions, financial damages. I thanked them for calling and hung up. Then I filed formal complaints with the Mississippi Public Service Commission, the Attorney General's Office, the Department of Environmental Quality, and every regulatory agency whose jurisdiction touched utilities, land use, or fraudulent permitting. I mailed complete evidence packages to each office so nobody had to rely on someone else's investigation. Finally, almost as an afterthought, I called the editor of our local newspaper. I expected a short article buried near the classifieds. Instead, a photographer met me at the cemetery that afternoon. He stood quietly while I brushed dirt from my grandmother's broken headstone before taking a single photograph. 2 days later, that image covered the front page beneath a headline that made my phone explode with calls before sunrise. By lunchtime, television crews had arrived. By evening, the story had spread across the state. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years were texting me. Strangers mailed sympathy cards. Veterans groups, church organizations, and historical societies began demanding answers. The company released a statement insisting it had followed proper procedures, but by then people had already seen the photographs, and photographs have a funny way of cutting through carefully written public relations language. Of course, there was a price. 6 days after the story went public, the owner of the diner asked me into his office. He couldn't even look me in the eye while explaining that business had slowed down and he needed to reduce staff. We both knew it wasn't true. His brother-in-law managed subcontracting crews for the utility company. I packed my apron into a paper bag, thanked my coworkers for everything, and walked out without making a scene. Sitting in my truck afterward, unemployed, uninsured, and staring at a future that suddenly looked terrifying, I wondered whether everyone had been right from the beginning. Maybe ordinary people really couldn't beat corporations this powerful. Maybe the system was designed that way. Then my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed the Office of the Attorney General. For a moment, I just stared at the screen because I honestly thought it had to be a prank. Finally, I answered, and the investigator on the other end introduced himself before saying 8 words that changed the course of everything. Ms. Carter, we'd like to ask you a few questions. Over the next several months, my life settled into a strange routine. Every Tuesday or Thursday, another investigator would call with another question, another document, another signature they wanted me to identify. At first, I assumed they were only looking into what had happened on my property, but one afternoon the lead investigator leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and asked, Ms. Carter, have you ever wondered why your case moved so quickly through the approval process? I admitted I had. He slid a folder across the table, and inside were photographs from construction projects in 4 different counties, different neighborhoods, different crews, different dates, the same forged signatures, the same false environmental reports, the same language describing occupied land as vacant property. My complaint hadn't started the investigation. It had unlocked one that had been impossible to prove until someone finally showed up with original records and refused to back down. For the first time since all this began, I realized my grandmother's cemetery hadn't been singled out because of some personal grudge. It had simply been another box on someone's schedule. Another shortcut taken by executives who believed deadlines mattered more than honesty. Somehow that made me even angrier. A few weeks later, I was asked to testify before a state review panel. I wasn't there as an expert or a lawyer. I was just the person who had refused to stop asking questions. Richard Malone walked into the hearing surrounded by attorneys wearing expensive suits that probably cost more than my pickup truck. When our eyes met across the room, he recognized me immediately. This time he couldn't disappear into another hallway. His attorney argued that mistakes had been made by contractors. Paperwork had been rushed because of public demand, and nobody had intentionally misled regulators. Then one investigator quietly projected the forged permits onto a large screen beside verified signature samples from the county inspector. The room became so quiet I could hear someone turning notebook pages 3 rows behind me. Malone shifted in his chair, loosened his tie, and stopped making eye contact with anyone. The investigation expanded for another several weeks before the final announcement came. Criminal fraud, forgery of government documents, multiple violations involving protected burial sites and unlawful land use. Richard Malone accepted a plea agreement rather than taking the case to trial. He was sentenced to prison, ordered to pay substantial personal penalties, and permanently barred from holding an executive position in the utility industry. The company itself agreed to millions in corrective work across several projects, paid significant state fines, restored my family's cemetery under independent supervision, compensated me for every month they had occupied my property without permission, and then came back asking to negotiate instead of dictate. That meeting felt completely different from the first one. Nobody ignored me in the lobby. Nobody misspelled my name. They addressed me as Ms. Carter every single time they opened their mouths. Their attorneys proposed purchasing the section of land outright. I shook my head before they even finished. The answer is no. They offered more money. I smiled politely. Still no. Finally, I slid my own paperwork across the table. If your equipment stays on my property, you lease the land. You pay every month, on time, under my conditions. One attorney frowned as he read the contract. This clause says if payment is missed, access is suspended. That's right, I answered. You have 72 hours to remove every piece of equipment. After that, whatever remains becomes my property under the terms of the agreement. He looked surprised. That's aggressive. I couldn't help smiling. So was bulldozing through my grandmother's cemetery. After a long silence, they signed. The first payment arrived exactly on schedule, and so has every payment since. A few months later, I found a new job managing the office for a local construction company whose owner told me during the interview, anyone willing to stand up to a corporation that size isn't someone I'm worried about trusting with paperwork. Sometimes life has a strange sense of humor. Even now, I still visit my grandparents every Sunday. The headstone has been repaired, the grass has grown back, and unless you knew where to look, you'd never realize what happened there. But I know. Every time I place fresh flowers beside Grandma's grave, I remember something she used to tell me as a little girl whenever I thought I was too small to make a difference. Character isn't measured by how loudly you speak. It's measured by what you refuse to stay silent about. I didn't beat a billion-dollar company because I was smarter than they were or richer than they were. I won because they built their entire strategy around one dangerous assumption, that an ordinary waitress would eventually get tired, scared, or broken up to walk away. They were wrong. And that's the part of the story I still think about the most. If they had simply apologized that first morning, repaired the damage, and treated my family with basic respect, none of this would have happened. Instead, one decision made by someone who thought nobody was watching and did a career exposed years of fraud and changed countless lives, including mine. So now, I'd really like to hear what you think. If you were standing where I stood that morning, looking at your own family's cemetery after a corporation crossed every line imaginable, would you have kept fighting even if it meant risking your job, your savings, and your future? Or would you have accepted a settlement and tried to move on? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And I'm genuinely curious where you think the line between justice, revenge, and accountability really is. And if this story stayed with you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes ordinary people never stand a chance against powerful corporations. Sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to look away.